We are still waiting for one of our panelists to join us, but I just sent her the link, so she should appear momentarily. Let us begin. The order of presentation today is that Tom Kochan will first give us an overview of the topic and of the context within which we are making these presentations. Then the plan is to go in order as listed in this slide here. But if Susan is not here on time, then we'll just begin with Joel and Spencer and Tom, and then we'll invite Susan thereafter. And I would go last. So over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Anil, and I'm happy to report Susan is with us. So we're all here and ready to roll. I want to first applaud the organizers of ILERA and this regional Congress. This is not easy to do in this age of Zoom and all of the complications, and I think it is working marvelously with a lot of behind the scenes and in front of the scenes work. And so congratulations to you and to our hosts in Canada. This is appropriate to have a strong regional international meeting here in Toronto, or I wish we were all here in Toronto, but wherever we are virtually in the beautiful city of Toronto. So thank you for hosting this Congress. Let me start by setting the context. We are going to focus on technology and its disruptive effects and its incremental effects. But while the world of the future of work has in the past several years been dominated by the view that technology is going to be the most important force shaping work of the future or driving work of the future, I think we've had some sobering realities intervene with the world in which we are sitting in today. And so before we turn to the technology, I just want to set that context for all of us. I've used this metaphor of a tinderbox before and say that we are sitting on a tinderbox. Maybe we should have an exploding tinderbox in this diagram right now, because all of these forces that are mentioned in this slide, the deep political divides in the United States, around the world, not quite as divisive in Canada, but still there. The end of this notion that we call the American dream, perhaps, that that today's generation of young people won't be able to achieve the same standard of living that their parents, that we all achieved. The deep racial tensions that have been surfaced in the United States and around the world as the Black Lives Matter protest groups really gain momentum in the wake of such tragic killings of Black people in the United States in recent months and in recent years. And then we have the deeper questions around trade, around technology, around the income inequality that has plagued us for so long. And all of this leads me to a view that what we need to do in this setting is to build a new social contract. We need a new way of bringing the parties together that brings business and labor and the entrepreneurs and the vendors of technology together with government and education forces to close these divisions, to build a more shared prosperity. And so this metaphor is something that I think many of us have emphasized for years. It's just as important, maybe even more important today, given all of the pressures that have arisen in this COVID crisis, in the racial divides that we are seeing, in the political divides that we are seeing, and the need to get on with it. And I just want to set the context one more time to emphasize the longer term trends that we all knew in our association, and we've all studied this in our own respective countries, how over time income inequality grew because somehow the proceeds from productivity and profitability have gone largely to the top 1%, to business and to investors rather than to the average workforce. And this comes from the United States, this diagram. And it shows that from the end of World War II through to around 1980, productivity, the dark blue line, moved in tandem with average compensation for workers. But then somewhere around the late 1970s, it began to depart. And then from 1980, productivity continued to grow and wages flatlined. For me, this one picture illustrates why we have such deep tensions, such deep anger, such frustration before the COVID crisis has hit us and before the racial tensions exploded in the last couple of months. Well, this is the context. These are the deeper pressures, but then we do have pressures around technology. And here's an example of the hubris that Elon Musk illustrated, that he was going to use technology. He was going to automate his automobile factory to build the Tesla electric vehicles out in California, where we used to have the NUMMI joint venture plant between General Motors and the United Auto Workers and Toyota. Well, he took over that and said and automated it to become the most automated plant in the world, and said, we're going to really show you how to build cars. Well, he unfortunately didn't do as well as he thought. And about 2 years later, he had to admit that maybe humans are underrated. Well, if there's one central message that we want to deliver in this session across our various presentations, it's that we have to think about technology differently. We have to think about how we integrate technology with work systems, with the workforce, how we're going to move from the notion that some vendor of automation is going to push technology into our plants or into our organizations in search of some problem of replacing workers, to something that's more creative, where we have a technology pull, where the problems that we see in society, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's adapting to the healthcare crisis, or whether it's some other aspect of a social problem, an economic problem, where the parties get together and say, how can we use technology effectively, as we are now in the COVID crisis, to redeploy some of our factories to make medical equipment, or where we are using all kinds of new mechanisms to extend broadband and software applications to reach the many young people who are struggling to learn from and continue their education at home. This is the world of work that we think we can shape if we do this creatively. And so now I think it's time to turn to first to Sue Helper, who's going to talk about Industry 4.0 and how that plays out. Then we'll hear from Joel Cutcher-Gershenfeld and from Spencer Lewis, and I'll join in when we talk a little bit about the healthcare sector, and then Anil's going to talk about AI. And throughout all of these presentations, let's keep in mind that we have to have an integrated approach. We have to think about what is the problem that we're trying to address. We have to really integrate the work design process with the technologies. We have to think about where training comes into this process so that we really make sure that we allow workers to use their wisdom to give wisdom to these new fangled machines and technologies that we're dealing with. And then finally, yes, some jobs will go away, some new ones will be created, some people will be displaced, and we have to think about how do we deal with those people who are most adversely affected. So that's just to set the context for what we're going to talk about. And let me now turn to Sue Helper. Sue.
Your mic is muted, Susan. Unmute yourself.
No, I don't think so.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Joel has to stop sharing his screen.
I did.
Oh, okay.
Okay, great. Let's see. And let me. Great. And so what I want to do is talk, I guess, go kind of down into the weeds of, how is technology actually adopted in a real industry, namely the auto parts industry in the US. And I have co-authors, Raphael Martins and Rob Siemens from NYU. And I want to acknowledge my long discussions and affiliation with the MIT Work of the Future project that Tom mentioned. That's also been very helpful. So just to define this term Industry 4.0, it has a number of names. It also goes by connected enterprise, but the idea is that you're going to continuously collect and analyze manufacturing data in real time. That this allows especially managers to remotely monitor operations. And ultimately the machines will be the ones that do the thinking. No need for workers to do the thinking or provide wisdom. The machines will do that themselves. And so we wanted to actually see, well, is that happening? And how do management practices affect the impacts of automation on job quality? And so we did both a lot of plant visits. So specifically for this project, starting in 2017, I've been doing visits in this industry since the 1980s. And then we also did a survey. And the survey is in the US. We also have the same data for Italy, which we're just beginning to bring in.
By the way, Susan, we're not seeing your slides.
That's odd. Oh, apologies. Okay. So this is my first graph then, which hopefully now people can see. We asked in the survey a question of to agree or disagree with the statement, we have found that use of information technology reduces the need for shop floor workers to have analytical skill. And so we interpret this question as essentially asking, are workers complements or substitutes for information technology? And you can see that this chart actually has quite a wide distribution, that there's, somebody answered at least all of the choices. But perhaps surprising, at least to the old version of Elon Musk, most of the, the weight of the distribution is on the complement side. And this is, I think, perhaps surprising if you read all this stuff about the way that robots are going to take all of our jobs. But if we think about what the what's going on here, it starts to make a little sense. So I think that what I want to draw from this slide is 2 points. One is that you see very different answers to this one question in the same industry. And so that the idea that a given technology or a given situation, demands a certain technology and a certain implementation of that technology, I think is incorrect. And second, that in fact, the weight of the views of the people in the industry, these are plant managers, is in fact that workers are complements, so that humans continue to be necessary. And so I want to just talk about a couple of examples of how that might actually work. So one supplier is a small company that makes heat shields and various kind of thermal product management products for cars. It's a small company, and they were adopting machine vision. The idea was that they were going to see if a part was present or absent. So replacing a human inspector with a camera. And it was done very simply with one engineer that basically put in the cameras. And no one really checked to see if the cameras were working or not. So one day I've been to this factory, is about 8 minutes from my house. And so one day I was there and I noticed people sorting parts, and what happened, well, somebody knocked the camera and the data was all bad. And there also wasn't an effort to kind of figure out, well, why did we get a misorientation? Why did we sometimes get spikes and defects, etc. So this just shows you what this factory looked like. And I mean, I think one thing that's quite interesting about this is the mix of old and new equipment. This is a 1950s manual stamping press. The worker is going to push buttons, the two buttons in the upper right of the screen, and the press will come down manually. And she'll grab parts from the left and insert the bolt. And then you can see on the right, in the where the red light is shining, she'll place her completed assembly on that fixture, and if she'll get a go no go signal. If it's correct, then she'll put it in the box. So that's one implementation. I think some relatively classic. She's not, we're just substituting the inspector. We haven't really added any training for anybody. We haven't done any root cause analysis, etc. A second example is the same technology in the sense of cameras and replacing inspectors in the Ford Cleveland engine plant, which is a union plant, a much more complex technology, but this is the same, in this particular piece of the technology, the camera is the same. There was extensive consultation with the UAW before and after implementation to eliminate, they had a lot of false positives initially that they had 40% defect rates apparently, and initially, and figured out a lot more of the root causes of some of the issues that they found. So this is just, here's one simple technology in widespread use, and in one case it has a pretty pure substitution effect. It doesn't, it works okay but not great. And then we have this other case where yes, there are fewer inspectors, but the workers who are left have deeper inspection tasks, and there's more work in reassigning that inspector to do additional work in data analysis that there wasn't capacity to do before. So this is kind of background then for a survey that we did of auto suppliers. We partnered with the Center for Automotive Research, and we got 2 automaker parts associations to bless the survey. And so we ended up with about 120 surveys of mostly sort of medium to large auto suppliers. I think the median employment at our firms was about 150. I guess it was 300 in the ultimate. And so these are classified as small businesses by the Small Business Administration, but actually somewhat large for small business. So we see that in fact lots of them are adopting these new technologies. So 3/4 of them have robots. And about 60% on average of their parts are tracked in some kind of automated way. What do the robots do? Mostly what they do is improve conformance, quality, and safety. This was just an opinion question, or how much do you think you've improved on each of these measures? There's some benefit of improved cost. But the weight of the distribution, or the average, is somewhere around small decrease in cost, so 5 to 10% of cost. But these impacts are differ by how the company thinks of its workers. And so we created a measure of what we called pragmatism. So the idea of, do we think that production workers are an important asset? Are production workers important in doing what Tom calls giving wisdom to the machine? And so we measured it using questions from the survey data. And so these were, and we just added together a series of dummy variables. Does the plant manager see workers as a complement to information technology? Do workers regularly diagnose equipment problems? They regularly use quality assurance data to recommend improvements, etc. One thing that I want to point out is the heterogeneity, again, across, a lot of research in this area will take the Dictionary of Occupational Titles from the US Department of Labor. They'll take an occupation and assume that that occupation is always done in the same way. And so here we have production workers, that's the job title, in a variety of plants in the same 4-digit NAICS code, motor vehicle parts. And we can see that just this value of this pragmatist variable ranges from 0 to 4. And so there's just a lot of variation in what the tasks look like. And this variation actually matters in terms of wages. So this is just a regression of operator compensation. So wages plus benefits. And what you can see if you go down, so it looks like a fairly, to the extent we could make a standard wage equation with our data, we included education, union status, size of plant, is it a multi-plant firm? And then in addition, we included variables about pragmatism. That turned out by itself to have no impact, not a significant impact on wages. We looked at the number of robots per worker, and when there are a greater number of robots per worker, that by itself tends to decrease wages. But if they have both pragmatism and robots, there's about a 20% increase in wages. So I think that what this suggests is that when you actually deeply involve workers in analyzing and collecting and analyzing the data that is generated by this digital equipment, that workers are complements in this kind of strict economic sense, that a worker, in fact, becomes more valuable in the presence of robots, and companies are, in fact, willing to pay more for it. So just to conclude this, kind of deep dive into a single technology, but I could tell kind of other stories of similar impacts, and just sort of saying what we've seen that firms actually pursue some different management paradigms when they adopt new technologies. We've seen that there's a Taylorist view that when robots essentially substitute for shop floor workers, and there's a pragmatist view in which they actually complement them. And if there is robots and pragmatism adopted together, we see that there's greater quality improvement compared to just having robots alone, and higher wages, but not higher costs compared to robots alone. So thanks very much, and look forward to the discussion, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Susan. Actually, I'll stop share for a minute while I get just say hello to everybody. This next presentation is actually going to be a 3-part story involving comments from Tom, who you've already seen, myself, and Spencer Lewis. Tom, did you want to go first, or shall I?
Go ahead, Joel. Just go through it.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to start at the place that I'm sure all of you expected me to start, which is with France in the 1400s. This is a tapestry from the middle 1400s in France. And I show it here because, as far as we know, the word institution was present in a Western language in the middle 1400s in France. There is a Sanskrit word that precedes it. But what's interesting to me is this tapestry shows the military, the monarchy, even a church. And those institutional arrangements were around for 500 to 1,000 years before there was even a word for institutions. So I want to focus on the rate of institutional change and fast forward to the Auburn Motor Company. This is a picture from around 1904. They got Henry Ford's idea of interlaceable parts. They didn't quite get the moving assembly line. They're going from sawhorse to sawhorse with their axles. My question for all of you is, how many have heard of Auburn Motors? A couple. If you drive through, but not many, if you drive through Auburn, Indiana, the factory that you're seeing in this picture is actually still there. It's now a museum. At the time of the picture, there were 130 car companies just in Indiana alone. Pretty much everybody who had who was making carriages was putting engines in them and becoming car companies. And I'm showing this for two reasons. One, it is true that those that figured out the whole new model became the household words of the last century, and those that got parts became footnotes that only a few of you have heard of. But equally, or perhaps more importantly, by this time, the pace of change had accelerated. In the space of 50 to 100 years, so an order of magnitude faster, political parties, trade unions, constitutional monarchies, boys' clubs, girls' clubs, all sorts of arrangements solidified and came into being. And so the pace had accelerated further. Now, if we come into a post-industrial world, a digital world, starting with Peoria and Sable, we see the documentation of what they call a second industrial divide. Carlos Peretta says, well, we've had 5 different technological revolutions with booms and busts. We might say we're in a second machine age. We already heard Sue mention 4.0. I think Klaus Schwab's book is kind of a hodgepodge without a clear underlying technological story. And myself and my brothers, I'll say a little bit about this, argue that there's actually 3 different digital revolutions: digital communication, computation, and fabrication. But what's common among all of these and a couple dozen other books is the view that we are at a pivotal moment in history, at a qualitative shift. And from an institutional point of view, what's important is that the pace of change has accelerated again. In 5 to 10 years, not 50 to 100 or 500 to 1,000, in 5 to 10 years, the rules of the game can change and change dramatically. Part of it is a technology story. We know if you go back to 1965, Gordon Moore made what's perhaps the most famous chart in history, the one on the top left corner, where he took 4 data points and did a log-log graph and said, gee, if those 4 points continue for 10 years, what's possible with the number of chips that you can fit onto, number of components you can fit onto a chip. His 1965 article was called Cramming More Components Onto Integrated Circuits, a delightful title. Of course, he was wrong. It wasn't just 10 years, it was 50 years, which is now called Moore's Law. He didn't call it that. But the chart below it shows that 50-year trajectory. It's starting to level off as we reach the limits of physics. But part of the driver of this accelerating rate of change is this Moore's Law and its equivalents. It's not deterministic. It doesn't mean that the change has to go in one direction, but it is certainly a heartbeat behind the change. And in our book, we, by the way, count the number of fab labs in the world over the last 10 years, which also shows that log-log straight line. And so later, if people are interested, I can talk about the implications of that roadmap. Digital fabrication is approximately where digital computation was in the late 1980s. But what I want to do is now come back to healthcare and dive in on it. The Department of Labor does projections on which professions are going to grow at which rate. They are largely linear projections based on known variables and factors. And so they say, well, surgeons are really going to be pretty flat, but surgical technologists will be growing by 9%. GPs, they actually see a similar 10% growth rate. Because of the aging in the population, they say, well, respiratory therapists are going to grow by 20%. This is pre-COVID. Those numbers are probably going to go up even higher. Of course, given what's happening in society, even back then, 2 years ago, they said behavioral substance abuse and mental health work is going to be increasing. And for our labor folks, arbitration looks like a growth industry by at least 6%. But here's the thing. These are assuming some continuous patterns of entry and growth in a profession they're not taking into account discontinuous technological change. And I want to unpack that in a couple of ways that will build on what Sue said. But before I do, I want to turn to Spencer Lewis, who's with us, a doctoral student from MIT, and have him, I'm going to stop the screen share just so that you can see him, and have Spencer begin to tell us about a survey that was done with Kaiser Permanente and the Alliance of Healthcare Unions.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Spencer Lewis, and I am a PhD student at the Heller School of Management and Policy. The first slide that you're seeing here is a breakdown of the survey that we have been given access to. But in January and February of 2019, Kaiser Permanente, in association with the Alliance of Healthcare Unions, inquired of over 3,000 Kaiser Permanente employees to try and understand how those employees perceive the impact of the labor management partnership and unit-based teams upon how they did work. The discussion that the information that I'll be presenting in the following slides uses this survey information to examine how these respondents perceive the place of technology in their day-to-day work. Next slide, please. In this slide, you get a point of view of the two lenses that we're using to group the respondents into. On the left side, we are examining how respondents varied based upon their participation in the unit-based teams, whether they're an actual UBT participant, whether they plan on participating in the UBT in the future, or whether they show absolutely no interest in the UBT. From this point of view, we see that generally those who are either interested or participating in the unit-based teams have a higher opinion, a higher perception of the importance of technology in their day-to-day work versus their peers that are generally not interested in the UBT. This carries over into also the difficulty of perceptions of difficulty of implementing new technology into their work. On the right side, we again examine the importance of technology in their work and the difficulty of implementing the technology, except we group respondents on how much training they have received in the labor management partnership, whether they've received orientation training within the last year, or whether they've only received the training that occurred when they were first hired, or whether they've never received training at all. In this case, when we divide the data this way, we see both the perceptions of the impact of technology, of new technologies in their workplace, and the difficulty of implementing those technologies to be fairly consistent, regardless of their orientation toward LMP training. In this slide, one of the other questions that was asked in the survey was to inquire of respondents what type of technologies ultimately impacted how they did their work, impacted how things operated in their workplace. As you can see, the actual responses that we received were very wide ranging. And included elements from hardware, new software tools, communication technologies, and unsurprisingly, given that we are looking at the healthcare industry, medications and different types of lab procedures. The main takeaway from this slide is to remind us that the term technology means different things to different people. Even from this group, this select group, we see that people perceive technology as very different across the board, and we have to be aware as we study technology's impact upon the workplace that this range of perceptions exists. Finally, we were interested in understanding how the respondents perceive the effectiveness of new technology in their workplace. Again, looking at respondent perceptions based on their activities within the unit-based partnerships. Again, we see a slight difference between those who are either participating or may in the future participate in the UBT and those that are not interested in participating in the UBT. Then looking at the division of respondents by the amount of orientation and training they've received in the labor management partnership. This time, we see that training may in fact impact perceptions of the effectiveness of technology in their workplace. As we see that respondents that never received labor management partnership orientation and training have perceive a lower impact of the effectiveness of a technology versus their peers that have received orientation training of some type.
Super. Thank you, Spencer. And while I appreciate the data from Kaiser Permanente, note that it's a single point in time. And now with COVID, people are doing virtual medical checkups and telemedicine and other things. So it will be interesting to know if these perceptions have shifted as the technology has become more even deeply integrated to healthcare. But what Spencer has shown is that there might be some training effects. There might be some effects of work organization, but that broadly speaking, we don't fully see from the survey what's behind the story with the technologies. And to talk about that, I'd really like to talk about two key theory concepts. The first is that in implementing new technologies, it can be done in a traditional sequential, or sometimes it's called a waterfall approach, where you first have a strategy, you implement, and then you train. But by the time it gets to training, you're very far removed from that core strategic decision-making. The more agile emergent approach is one where the digital business strategy and the workforce strategy and the training are, in a sense, three different legs of the stool or three triangles in a continuing cycle where you're constantly learning and adjusting. So what Spencer was reporting on training is, I think, the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding what kind of system it is. The last thing that I want to share, pulling back the lens even further, is in a sense a question about how do we think about the opportunities for voice with technology. In the Kaiser Permanente case, it's through frontline unit-based teams or other kinds of forums, user groups. Those are all bottom-up mechanisms, which in an agile mode are a central part of the work itself. In a waterfall mode are late and after the fact. I have a picture of the cover of a book called Sense and Respond. I wrote the foreword to it. It's based on a guy who ran the call center for Hitachi UK. And he had a radical idea. Instead of measuring people by how many calls they can handle in an hour, he said, take one call, understand deeply the problem, and then you have 4 hours to go back with engineering and figure out how to prevent the problem from recurring. So the voice of the customer became an engine for continuous improvement in product innovation. What was a cost center became a profit center as it drove new ideas into the system. And so that's a kind of bottom-up kind of voice with technology. Of course, there's things like the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy that announced all federal data needs to be open. Tom mentioned the idea of people giving wisdom to machines. It's a term that Toyota actually took the term jidoka, which was a Japanese term, and redefined it to have that meaning. And those are both things at sort of a policy level where people are, in a sense, setting policies that are designed to be more open and inclusive. But the piece that I'd like to close on is to highlight that what we see are these lateral or middle out or middle across mechanisms that are quite interesting. Wikipedia, it isn't just an architecture with distributed users. It has this middle level of thousands of editors who really build out and maintain quality for what has replaced encyclopedias around the world. The R software that many of you use in statistical analysis has module developers, these empowered middle folks. Minecraft is probably the most popular video game in the world, has these mod developers, about 10,000 of them. And then there are these different lateral associations, multi-stakeholder bodies. I put a couple of them there, the Internet Society Foundation, the Center for Open Science. But in our own research on these consortia in the geosciences, we counted 6 or 7 between 1950 and 2000, and over 70 since 2000 to 2020. So that the institutional format that goes with the technology is evolving and emerging, and we see these new organizational forms that represent ways that people might have voice with respect to the technology. And it's with that in mind that I'd like to now hand it back to Tom.
Thank you, Joel. I'll just make 1 or 2 concluding comments for our session. You might ask, why do we focus on Kaiser Permanente? Well, the conceptual points we've been making throughout this presentation basically say we need to integrate the people and the work processes with technology. And we think Kaiser Permanente is well positioned to do that because they've had this long-standing labor management partnership. So about a year ago, they've asked us to come and study them again and to look at how they are preparing for the future of work. And so we have a variety of projects underway, none of which are completed, so I don't have any real findings to report here. But we do see that there are signals and there are institutional arrangements for taking a design concept of worker-centered design and people-centered design and the agile description that Joel mentioned, to work together to use modern healthcare information technology-based tools to open up new clinics for outpatient care in very creative ways with lots of advanced training, lots of consultation, lots of teamwork, and the labor management partnership then has to renegotiate some of the job descriptions and the compensation arrangements and work together with the parties. So we are excited about what we are learning there. We think it is the way we need to see more examples like that. They have a joint set of workforce of the future committees in each of the regions, and they are really working to create the future of work using new technologies. So we think it embodies many of the principles that we are talking about here today. So thanks for listening to us, and now let's turn it over to our good friend Anil, and he's going to talk about AI developments. Anil, you might want to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. The two presentations that we've had, both the one on healthcare and before that on auto, they're really good in-depth look at industries where we can take specific examples and work out these concepts. I'm afraid that my talk is at a much broader general level, and it is from a forthcoming publication, so I put a plug in here. I worked with a few others on a report called Preparing for the Future of Work in Canada, and it will be published next month by the OECD. And so this work was done taking Ontario as a case study. And so in that context, I share these ideas with you. And our emphasis is on public policy response. So what we wanted to do was to try and think about how artificial intelligence, and that word is not to be taken literally, because there are a series of adaptive technologies, self-learning algorithms, etc., that are broadly put under the label AI. And some people don't like the word, or they have very specific understanding of that word. So what I'm referring here to is adaptive technologies that can be used to automate functions. And so we want to take a look at how this would impact jobs, what kind of job disruption we might expect, and then to go at the county level in 3 regions in Ontario to see how well prepared they are or they are not to deal with this disruption. So here I just share with you, because of these questions about what are we talking about, is that the guts of a basic intelligent technology or adaptive and intelligent technology is that there's a whole bunch of sensors in the front end, and they generate large amounts of data. So think of a driverless car is generating all that data, and that's the field of big data. And people are developing algorithms as to how to make sense of that data and to understand it. That is fed into decision-making algorithms, at which point you get a decision and then you put it back along with the data coming from sensors. And this, over repeated cycles, over millions of cycles, can get very accurate. As you know, you may have heard of, is that IBM now has the Big Blue that can play chess and can almost defeat the world champion at chess. So this is the kind of power that we are putting in handheld devices that can be used in real time to make decisions, etc. But let us keep in mind, and this is a point that connects with the other 2 presentations, is that this decision is still probabilistic. It might get to a very high probability, but it's never 100%. And we just had a case this week of a person who was wrongly arrested by police in Pennsylvania somewhere because the face recognition software said, this is the bad guy, get him. And when they got him, they realized they had the wrong man. Okay, then in the report, we talk about some of the trends, and you've already heard about this, is that there has been job polarization already from the technologies that we have implemented. And here is an analysis that the OECD did for many countries in the OECD. That is, they divided the jobs by high skill, low skill, and medium skill. And here this purple bar is the medium skill. And you see only a modest decline, this is Canada, modest decline in low skill, because we still need those people and we have not figured out how to automate many of those low-skill jobs. And of course, high-skill jobs grew. This is the period from mid-90s to mid-2010s. It's approximately a 20-year period. And so what we see is a hollowing out of the middle-level jobs. And this story repeats across OECD countries. US is here on the right-hand side. So US is a big economy and with lots of different regions. So in percentage terms, it was not so impacted, at least up till the mid-2010s. Canada was impacted more, and this is the OECD average. Let's go to the next slide. Here at a more disaggregate level, I can share with you, these are the census metropolitan areas in Ontario at the bottom. And within each, we estimate the risk of automation. Now, this is the Frey and Osborne methodology, where you take a job, an occupation, divide it into its tasks, and you get experts to assess how likely it is that that task can be automated using the technology we have today. And that gives you a probability of automation of that particular occupation. And this purple bar is that the job is under high risk of automation, and then the gray bar is the significant risk. So if you add significant risk and high risk, you almost get to, you can see all these bars for different cities, is somewhere around the 45 to 50% mark. And so that's fairly high, 4 to 5 jobs out of 10 in these places are likely to feel some impact. And here's a chart again. This is from the Kitchener-Waterloo area, an area just west of Toronto, where I'm showing you the top 5 occupations that are at risk of automation, at high risk of automation. And number 1 is business and administration associate professionals. Roughly 4.3% of the jobs are in this group, and that's a total of 31,700 jobs. Now, these numbers may not mean a lot in a larger country like the US, but these are significant numbers that we're talking about. If you add this, it's close to 100,000 jobs in this small county alone. So there will be a significant impact. Now, before I consider public policy response, let me just talk briefly about the assumptions that we are making about adaptive technologies in the next 3 to 5 years. So it's a near to medium term outlook, because we don't know what will happen beyond that, is that AI would replace tasks, not entire jobs. So the driverless car, which is the most popular image people give when they talk about AI, is the exception. It's not the rule. So we are not likely to see entire jobs completely disappear because a robot could do all of the functions of that particular job. Now, in some jobs, you could automate, let's say, 80% of the tasks. That would be highly impacted. Or in some jobs, it would only be 5 or 10%. So the extent to which a job is affected would vary, but rarely would we have a job where 100% of its functions would be done by AI. And of course, AI would enable and is enabling greater competition globally, because there's a lot of stuff that you can do remotely, sitting somewhere else. And so it creates more of a global workforce. And of course, AI would also create significant demand for new skills. So we should not forget in this discussion of disruption that there's only loss, there's also creation of jobs. Okay, now let me just share this idea through the schematic. Is here on the x-axis, I show the share of disrupted tasks in a given job. So let's say my job as a professor would be impacted at the low end of the scale, let's say somewhere between 1 and 25%. Then there could be jobs that are impacted somewhere in the middle, 40, 60%, or 80 to 100% of the tasks could be automated, so they would be highly impacted. And on the y-axis here, I show the skill level of the job for the worker. So you could have a low skill job, a medium skill job, or a high skill job. And here, this bar is meant to show that all our jobs will be affected to smaller or larger extent with AI. And we would have to train or retrain people to work with technology, because we are not going to get rid of them. We still need them because only a small portion of their job can be done by AI, and we will still need those people. In the middle, yes, some jobs will disappear because we would need fewer people, and we're likely to see a lot of job redefinitions. So jobs will be combined and job descriptions will be written and people will be assigned. So at least 40 to 60% of the people would still do those jobs, but the remainder will have to be retrained and redeployed. And at the high end, we would need an exit strategy, that is to phase out the job and to tell people that, look, we are not going to do this manually anymore, so you have to migrate to some other occupation or industry or region. And this is simply an explication of the same chart that I shared earlier. And you can see that there will be different responses. For example, some people, let's say highly skilled people, a professor who has to now learn to use Zoom or has to use a software to grade essays, would be expected to just engage in self-paced learning or take online webinars, etc., and they would adapt more easily. And even if you are medium or low skill, you could get on-the-job training if the number of tasks that are going to be automated are not severe. At the high end, if your job is greatly impacted and you have the skills, this is at the high end, you have the skills to go back to school and learn something, then perhaps you will take the education route. And similarly, you will have different responses in this matrix, depending on where you fall. This chart is simply separating the job from the worker, because an exit strategy for a job is different from an exit strategy for the worker. And we have had enough restructuring since the 80s, so we have some of these institutions to retrain and redeploy. It's just that the demand will be much heavier on those systems. Lastly, let me address the issue of who pays, the two questions for skill development. Who decides who will get the training and who pays for it? So training or skill investment is a partnership between individuals, the state, and the employer. And if you look at who spends how much over the life course, and what I did here was I put skill formation over the life course from early education to higher education, mid-career training, retraining, and re-education. And this is the investment required in dollars, who has to spend the money. And what we see is that we have some traditional patterns. These curves, this one is a schematic showing government's expenditure. So governments are involved more in early education, and they might be more involved in re-education when people go back to school or college. But during the career of that person, the government reduces its investment. Employers are kind of convex curve. That is that they spend less on early education and they don't want to spend on re-education, but perhaps they spend their money in the middle. And for individuals, it's a rising curve because as you get older, the opportunity cost of learning is higher and higher, so you don't want to be learning. Let me end by sharing with you our conclusion. So number one, that investment in skills will have to go up by an order of magnitude in the next 3 to 5 years. This is, I'm afraid there is no shortcut to this. This is just a must, and one way or another, we have to pay, and if we don't pay, we'll be left behind. Number two, that institutions who are involved in this business of skill development, whether it's a business or university or college or the government, they have to become more agile because these changes are coming so fast at us that we don't have a lot of time to respond. So we have to learn to respond quickly. Number three, that expenditures can be increased, but it's not clear which of the three partners would increase their expenditure. So let me consider each one of them. Public expenditure could be increased, but only you can justify it only if it is smart enough to lever additional investments from employers and individuals, because then you'd be able to sell it to the voter. Individuals would spend more money, and in fact, they are spending much more money now than they did 20 years ago, 25 years ago, on their training and education, but they have very poor labor market information. So when you see a lot of structural unemployment, that young people have gone to school, they have learned something, and they cannot find a good job or a proper job, it's because they don't have good labor market information. So if you provide that information, individuals would spend more. Employers, well, if you look at Canadian employers, we are not the leaders or the exemplars. In fact, there's been a trend of disinvesting in skill development, where employers go to the labor market and they say, I just want someone who's ready to start work tomorrow. You know, I don't have time or money to spend on training. So employers need to step up. And lastly, let me just add that the ILO in their 100th year have adopted the Centenary Declaration, which envisages a universal minimum right to work, a right at work. And they have said that the right to acquire skills and to train and to learn is a universal right that should be guaranteed by all governments. So let me stop there. And now we have some time for questions. So please send your questions through the chat function or raise your hand so that we can recognize you.
So Anil, there's at least 3 questions in chat. I'll just read them and then we can all lean in. One is, cooperatives are suffering during the crisis. Are they being more or less present following COVID? A second is, with the transition from work to home, will that lead to greater automation and more offshoring of work? And the last, appreciation, by the way, for your presentation, but what skills will be in the greatest demand? What does this have to do with STEM versus arts? And you know, where there is automation, will it exacerbate gender inequality? So a number of really good questions are already in. I have some thoughts on these, but I'm going to hold back for Tom, Sue, Anil, or Spencer.
Okay, so I defer to Susan and Tom to take a couple of those, and then I'll weigh in.
So do you want to take this skills of STEM versus arts, since you're seeing that in the factories that you've been studying?
Yeah, maybe I'll make a couple of comments. So there's a really interesting paper by Richard Freeman and Michael Handel and some other people that looks at change in occupation over time. And they find that most of the change in tasks actually occurs within occupation rather than between occupation. And so you can sort of, I guess, think of that as sort of good news that employers already have mechanisms, that don't necessarily involve, wholesale booting out of workers, but rather of gradually changing occupations. So that's one comment. A second comment, I think, on the training is I think there's two ways in which the current training debate makes me a little nervous. One is there's a kind of assumption that we just need to plug and play workers. And I think there's a lot of work that suggests that you actually, in order to get the most benefit of a technology, from a firm point of view, you really need to reorganize. So I think my work suggests that, these older institutions of things like quality circles are even more important now that you have more data and more readily available data to analyze. And they're also important in figuring out, what even is the right data to collect. And so that suggests then that not just sort of narrow training in, here's a machine, here's a welder, here's how to turn it on, that's actually not what you want, either as a worker or as a firm, because there's so much uncertainty. You're going to be welding. You'll be welding with this kind of welder. And so then things like critical thinking, statistics, understanding principles of physics are useful problem solving from the point of view of firms. And then I guess I would also think that we've come so much to this idea that education is so that you get a job as opposed to become a better citizen. And so for all those reasons, I think that this new training, should be focused less on specific certifications, to become a welder or a truck driver or a phlebotomist or something, and more on, deepening basic skills for problem solving, analysis, it's working in groups, etc.
So I'd actually like to lift up what Susan's saying, if I could, in the following sense. What you're pointing to is a more modular set of skill-based training and development institutions. A number of years ago, we did a study at the Boeing St. Louis plant where they moved all of their training into 1 and 2 hour modules. So you might not become, if you were an electrician, trained as a welder, but in about 6 hours, a series of 1 hour modules, you could become safety certified to weld one clip as part of the wiring that you're installing, and so on, with ended up being over 100,000 tasks trained in a year. And the good news about that is people really were able to be flexible and adaptable. The bad news is that anyone who left Boeing couldn't get credit for that anywhere else because no one knew what that system was or how it worked or what it meant to be skill certified in a list of merit badges, so to speak. And so if you look at the underlying logic of digital technologies, they are modular. There's bits and bytes that you assemble and disassemble. And so I think the institutions in a digital world do need to look more like the technology itself in exactly the way that you're describing. That's a bigger thesis. But the smaller point is that most of our institutions are oriented around careers, jobs, categories that bundle together rather than tasks. And that's a big institutional challenge.
So
let me build. Oh, go ahead, Sue.
I actually think I'm almost saying the opposite of what you're saying. And I guess maybe what I would say is I imagine those Boeing workers had a pretty good foundation. They probably had been through an apprenticeship in one, if they were an electrician, they had, pretty serious underlying training and pretty good math and reading skills.
Uh-huh.
And so then if you have that on top of that, you could then layer things. But if you're thinking about quick certifications, and not learning the underlying analysis,
there are foundational things you do on a piecemeal fashion. I buy that.
And so there's actually when the there's a great book about the Janesville GM plant that closed, and there's some evidence that workers that actually took retraining, that they had this elaborate thing of, finding in-demand jobs and offering you quick skills. Well, they sent, everybody to welding training. So, they've identified there's 20 welding jobs, and they send people to welding, and it turned out, well, it wasn't actually the kind of welding that they needed. And so then people then had spent $1,000 or they had learned to be truck drivers. They spent a couple $1,000. And more importantly, several months of their lives, and there was no job at the end, and they had no general skill. So I think it's the foundational skill is really important, and we underinvest in those. And if you have those, then people can much more adapt. So I think we have a lot of change, and then helping people adapt and become more creative thinkers. I guess I think of as an important thing to do.
Well, I just want to briefly interject, Susan, that in our project we took a look at legacy systems of training and skill development, and looked at what we are going to need down the road. And things are becoming so complex that this whole simplistic idea that, oh, there's a demand, there's someone in Ohio is looking for 20 welders, so let's just start a welding program. This is very crude. So we have to use AI, and there are people are developing these interfaces where you talk to a bot, you tell them who you are, your entire skill and training history and aptitude and so on. And this bot would then sift through the data, looking ahead a little bit rather than what the demands are today, and then say to you that, look, I think you could do one of the following 5 things, at which point you take your data and the feedback and you go and see a live counselor to see how you can be matched. I think this matching of skills or demand with supply of skills has to get a lot more sophisticated in the next 3 to 5 years.
I've seen that in some organizations. We're studying a large high-tech firm that has a learning system, as they call it, that takes you from the job that you are in today and shows you where your skills might either be close to ready for some jobs in the future, or where you have deficiencies, and a range of courses that one could take to close the gap. And I think we're going to see more and more of that along the lines that Anil articulated. And some of these are quite sophisticated and quite involved. But the problem is those kinds of systems tend to be available in the best companies, in the highest technology companies, in the large firms.
But Tom, in this world in the future, this service has to come from a public source. So
yes,
it has to be available to all, and it has to be available at no cost.
Yeah.
In one county in Ontario has developed a matrix where you identify, but it's very limited because it has only 100 occupations. So when you press, you see yourself as a circle, and there are 100 other circles on the map, and it will draw paths. Say, well, you could go here or here or here. And that's the beginning of what I'm hoping that will enter and will become universally available. But if private industry does this, then it'll be a patchwork.
So,
No, that's right. No, I completely agree. And that's my concern. That
but there are
there's
two questions in the
a
chat.
small number of firms that are doing this, but we need to generalize it. There are some communities that are also doing this. South Bend, Indiana has something called Bendable, which is a takeoff on their term, on the city's name, where there's community organizations centered around the public library where you can go and get that kind of analysis that you're talking about, Anil. And then there's employers who post job openings based around that. So I think we're beginning to see some of this happen, but we need to see more of it. The question on automation, I think, is an important one. In the recession of 2007 to 2009, the Great Recession from the financial collapse, the evidence is that firms did invest more in upskilling, automation related tasks, jobs, and processes. I think we're going to see even more of that now. We're going to see more firms say, I've got to be resilient to all of these uncertainties, and if workers can't come to work, we've got to figure out how we can invest more in automation. And then what do we need to do to skill the workforce to be more agile, to take on more of these tasks with technology? And that's going to accelerate the impacts and the inequalities in our economy if we don't do some of the other things that we just were talking about to deal with those people who may be displaced as this plays out. So I worry about this if we don't have a very, very strong public investment at the federal and at the state and maybe even at the local level of of training and of and educating firms about how to use technology in complementary ways as opposed to labor displacing.
So Tom and Anil and Sue and Spencer, there's two questions in the chat that get to embedded inequalities in AI. And essentially, the AI algorithms are so complex that no one can actually reprogram it per se. And certainly there are implicit and explicit biases that show up in these algorithms. Some architectures can be designed for user input, for ways to nudge, if you will, the social dynamics that address inequalities. But most of the folks who design these technologies are essentially designing black boxes that are opaque and that can have unexpected and negative outcomes. And so people would like us to talk about, maybe overconfidence in AI when it can have unexpected negative consequences.
So, I'd like to add that the problem with technology adoption, one of the problems, is that we think it is way smarter than it is. And there is a theorem about technology adoption, which is that we always exaggerate the short-term impact and we underemphasize the long-term impact. So let's take facial recognition, for example. So they designed it. Now it turns out that it's not very accurate when recognizing people of certain races. And so now that we know it, we can now regulate or limit its use or improve the technology so that it can recognize everybody irrespective of race with the same accuracy. And the same thing with gender inequality. There's a question that if you are matching, if you have an algorithm matching people with potential jobs, could there be bias? Well, I would say, first of all, design them with only the tasks so that there is no input of gender. Then you begin to use it, and then if you see that it's systematically directing women, or women end up being directed one way and men directed another way, then it's not the technology that's creating that bias. It's the fact that women who are coming into the system to use the system, they only have a certain set of skill sets. So then that's bias that's already incorporated, that's you're feeding into the system. So all I'm saying is that because there is bias, we don't have to be afraid of the tool, the technology. We just have to understand what its effects are, and we have to improve it until it gets to be acceptable.
Although that raises then the question, who governs the technology? Having it in the public sector may be better than having it in distributed piecemeal commercial hands, but it still raises a deeper question about the capacity of government institutions to be agile in responding to emergent dynamics with the technology.
Not just
Europeans. Go ahead, Spencer.
Oh, I was going to say that from a certain point of view, the bias is an unexpected outcome of the technology. And in a sense, what we're talking about is dealing with the unexpected, because in many cases, the AI is a black box, thereby saying that not only do we need institutions looking at how the AI is implemented and used, but also those institutions to be agile enough to deal with something that's unexpected, that wasn't perceived.
The European Union has two regulations that, or two criteria in their regulations of AI that try to address this, but God help them to implement it. One is that AI cannot have discriminatory effects. And therefore, if you can show that it does, it can't be used. The second is that it has to be what they call explainable. And I think several people have already commented that the algorithms are often so complicated, you can't identify what is driving the outcome. When we do regression equations like Sue presented, well, Sue can say, look, this interaction between the pragmatism and the robot measure, it explains this amount of variance and has this magnitude of effect, and unions have this, and gender has this, and so on. And so it's more transparent. But when you have just throwing a lot of data in to predict without knowing how they all interact, often you can't explain, you can't attribute the results to any particular set of variables. And this, I think, says you should not let the algorithms determine decisions. There always ought to be some humans involved, especially now as we see these applied more and more to human resource management decisions of hiring, of firing, of promotion, of judging people's competence and judging people's suitability for different kinds of jobs in the future. It's being used in all of these ways in HR, and there are a growing number of lawsuits saying that why did Joel get hired, but I didn't? If you can't explain to me why I didn't get hired and Joel did for a given occupation or given job, then I think you shouldn't be using that system. You can use it to inform decision makers on Joel's potential versus my potential, but there has to be a combination of human judgment that then supplements and complements the technologies. And if we don't enforce those kinds of principles in our profession, then I think we are going to have more and more problems down the road.
And just to lift up, Tom, what you're saying, I do think you should get the job, not me, but there's a fellow at Penn State, Mike Maffei, who's been studying the unionization among Uber drivers. And they, of course, face an algorithm that decides when they're in surge, when they're not. And what he's finding is that Uber is opaque about how their algorithm works, but the Uber drivers are reverse engineering it by talking to each other. What happened to you? What did you get? What did I get? And they're figuring out imperfectly, but remarkably well, what the system actually is doing in order to organize against it. And so you get a whole new class of activities of working against the algorithm and, in a sense, organizing not against the employer, but against the technology.
You know, one thing I want to add, there was a question on working from home. And the question was, do you think that after this pandemic and lockdown, that either, and that people are getting used to working from home, that they would just, this home will be in some other country, that it would become a trigger to export more jobs? I think at the margin, this was already happening before COVID-19. And I'm not sure if COVID-19 by itself would accelerate, because there are certain organizational functions for which you need people to come into the office. That's why those jobs are there. Even if some people begin to work more from home, if they worked from away 100% of the time, how are you going to do essential functions like recruitment and orientation, training, team building? How would that person get to know you, your organization, and the boss and co-workers, etc.? So if it were possible to run an entire company by outsourcing from home, that is, that you hire people in India or Philippines or China or Russia, and then you just have a shell company sitting in somewhere in Boston. If that were possible, they have already done it. So my take is that COVID by itself, if anything, will demonstrate that while some work can be done from home, there are certain other aspects of the job that require the human interaction, at least for now.
We do have a raised hand from one of our participants, Ting Ting.
Okay, Ting Ting, go.
Oh, I thought we were running out of time. I think this is fascinating.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, fascinating discussion. I was wondering, like, you know, the whole definition about digitalization or, you know, technology change. Maybe we should kind of like separate them into different bundle of digital or technology change. For example, some are the two changes, some are the knowledge change, and they will have a different kind of impact to shape how we do our job, or what type of a job, or what proportion of the job being changed or affected, and even fundamentally change how we define the boundary of the profession and how organizations perform their kind of like coordinate work. So I think all those things need to be taken into consideration, and also echo the discussion about this whole training and upskilling kind of a, you know, part. I think, like, especially in the US, there's a big issue is who's responsible for paying for those trainings. There are good companies that provide those, you know, modularized trainings or paying for the outside external trainings. But there are many other companies that rely on the workers to pay for the training upfront, and they hire just-in-time kind of labor and talent. So how do we address this in our whole discussion? That's my question.
So I think that we have to end on that topic. You have to pray to get your answer from above, because it is 6 o'clock. But, you know, this is why we need a system in which we can increase investment in skill formation. But the state, I feel, has to take the lead, and they have
You're muted.
to so that employers and individuals will join in.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Yeah.
Lots of fun.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
And thanks to all the attendees for joining us. I give the thumbs up.